This is lecture 18A. Today we're going to talk about the Americas, and we're going to bring the Americas right up to 1500 basically. So last time we checked in the civilizations around central Mexico, we had Teotihuacan, which was a fairly large city that was built a sort of a network of influence through trade around Lake Texcoco. But Teotihuacan began to decline in the 700s, and in the 900s you see another city rise up, the Toltecs, and they create a sort of an empire on the northern edge of Lake Texcoco, and that would last from the 900s until about 1125. In 1125, a civil war breaks out between different factions in the government, and for the rest of its existence, the Toltecs are basically fighting each other, and their influence everywhere else is just falling apart and disappearing. And so, beginning in the late 1100s, as you see this period of sort of there's no centralized power, there's no major power, there's a bunch of small city-states, and there's a lot of movement and dynamism in the population around Lake Texcoco. Lake Texcoco was a big lake. And into this, you see the arrival of the Mexica. The Mexica were people from northern Mexico, and they had moved around quite a bit. We're not sure why they were moving as much as they were, but they moved into the Lake Texcoco region in the mid-1200s, and at first they have no land, and they can't find any land. They can't push anybody else off of land. So they rent themselves out as mercenaries to other cities, states who need soldiers for something, or they try to catch on with this group or that group, but they don't really succeed. Until what they finally begin to do, though, is they find a series of islands in Lake Texcoco that are uninhabited, and they are in pretty shallow water. And what they begin to do then is the islands aren't big enough to really support their population through agriculture. So what they do is they live on the islands, and then they begin to build up this, they begin to build these frames, these wooden frames that they drive stakes into the bed of the lake in 3, 4, 5 feet of water. And they would fill up these frames with dirt, and then they would basically create farm fields out of nothing. And it looked like these fields were they'd plant corn or something, and it looked like these fields were floating on the lake. They were in fact built into the base of the lake, but they were floating on the water, so to speak. And this was called the Chinampa system. And this allowed the Mexica to begin to really flourish. As they built more and more Chinampas, they had more and more land. And they were fairly immune to attacks because they're on a series of islands in the middle of the lake, so it was a pretty good defensive position. And so they began to grow, and they began to flourish. And they founded a city, Tenochtitlan, and they really began to do pretty well with trade and et cetera. And so the Aztecs, or the Mexica, then begin to become major political players in the course of the 1300s and then into the early 1400s. And now there's a whole bunch of other city-states around here. There are lots of cities nearby, just a couple miles away along the lake shore, and then there are lots of cities at various points around the other shores of the lake. And so the Mexica begin to look around and say, well, is there a way we can expand our influence? Is there a way we can build an empire here? And two Mexica leaders in particular began to build what came to be called the Aztec Empire. The first is Izcoatl, who ruled from 1428 to 1440, and then his immediate successor, Moctezuma I, ruled from 1440 to 1469. And these two put together a fusion of a new religion, which I'll talk about in the second part of this lecture, with a pretty centralized government system and a really efficient military system. And so these guys really organized the key pieces of an empire. And so what they did at first is they simply looked at the cities right next to them. The cities like Tlacopan and Texcoco were two nearby cities, and they conquer them. But then what they do is they basically leave the cities alone. They say, okay, we've conquered you. Now you have to send us tribute every year. And the tribute has to be, it has to be partly gold and silver and textiles and grain and things like that. But also, you need to send us soldiers. And so what the Aztecs are doing here is they're essentially saying every time we conquer a city, we get more soldiers. So then we can conquer more cities. And so they conquer Tlacopan and Texcoco, and they force those cities into sort of an uneasy alliance, an unequal alliance. And then they say, you guys are going to supply the soldiers for us to go conquer other people. And then they start to really expand because they have this system now. Every time they conquer a city, they get more money and more tribute, and they get more soldiers they can use to conquer the next city. And so they expand. First, they expand southward. They're sort of on the southwest side of Lake Texcoco. And by the way, I just want to mention, I think I mentioned this when I was talking about Teotihuacan a while ago, but Lake Texcoco is no longer there. It's underneath Mexico City right now. And so essentially what happened is they filled in the lake to build the city over it. But they first move south, and they conquer some cities there, and then they move to the east, and they get all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And so they conquer a fairly large area, and then they start to expand north. And they really are unstoppable after a while because they're so much bigger than any of the cities they're confronting. And the other cities would try to build alliances to combine their strength to stop the Aztecs, but it never worked. And the Aztecs were simply too efficient and too brutal and too good at what they did. And so they began to expand. Now, at its height, the Aztec Empire might have had 21 million people in it. We don't know. We do know that the city of Tenochtitlan, the main city, was really an astonishing city. It probably had 200,000 people living on the islands directly, but then if you look at the larger sort of area, Tenochtitlan might have been 500,000 people in the larger metropolitan area. And it was a really amazing city. It had these wide boulevards, and it had these huge temple complexes, an enormous central market, which is bigger than anything in Europe. And so when Europeans arrived, they were amazed, they were awed by Tenochtitlan. And it was built on these islands, and so it had there was still water between the islands, and so it had a sort of feel like Venice, lots of canoes and boats going back and forth. And then it had three major causeways or sort of bridges built to the mainland that connected it by, so you could walk to Tenochtitlan. But it's really an amazing city, and as it became wealthier and wealthier with the tribute that they're getting from these other cities, it began to really become opulent, and you really see this emergence of these new classes of people in the Aztec Empire that are fantastically wealthy and living in these huge palaces with sumptuous clothing and servants and slaves, etc. And so you see the emergence of a priestly class, and again, I'll talk about the religion later. And then you see the emergence of a warrior aristocracy, and the two are kind of interconnected. And in fact, later, some of the later emperors in the Aztec Empire are actually priests who become emperors, not warriors. So the two classes become intermarried and intertwined. But they essentially, these upper classes, just lived off the tribute from all these cities that they are controlling. And this actually meant that the Aztecs had fairly low overhead. They didn't have to have a ginormous bureaucracy to collect taxes from the whole population and to keep track of land. All they needed to know was that city had to provide this much every year, right? And so where that city got that money and that tribute and what the people were farming and doing, that was the city's problem to figure out. They just had to come up with the money every year. So this allowed the Aztecs to have a fairly low overhead as far as government goes. But it also meant that the Aztecs had a certain need to keep conquering things because they needed a justification for war to continually justify the warrior class at the top of society and so they needed sort of constant warfare. And they got more tribute from conquering a city and immediately sort of plundering it than they did from the annual tributes over time. And so the Aztecs had a sort of an internal logic that they had to keep conquering things. They had to keep growing, right? And later on, we'll see that the Aztecs actually create a cult around their emperor, that he is godlike himself, that he is a god. So that's the sort of basics of the rise of the Aztec Empire, and I'll talk more about their religion in the second part of this lecture.